Tonight, I'm going to tell what I think is one of the most exciting stories of Dutchess County about slavery and the fight for freedom, how local people became national leaders, self-emancipation, Quaker anti-slavery, political upheaval, and eventually abolition and the Underground Railroad. Some of the people will meet: John Woolman, Lucretia Mott, David Irish, Aaron Powell, and at the end, James Talmadge Jr. Other folks who are in tonight's story are less well known, such as Tom, Primus, Cuff, Prince, Palm, Georgia, and Peter, all freedom seekers who self-emancipated from our eastern Dutchess area. And there are as well many Quakers whose names we don't know. The early Quakers from Quaker Hill, 9 partners, most of whose names are lost to history. All of these help to create what I believe is one of the most important stories of the anti-slavery movement in the country. For a good period of time, involving many people, Eastern Dutchess County led the anti-slavery movement in the United States. What did you learn about the Quakers? They were religious, diligent, successful in business, and peace-seeking, friend to the slave, opposed to slavery even. What did you learn about enslaved Black Americans? Perhaps not as much. Their histories have been lost or purposely buried, written out of history as it's known. Most Black people in tonight's story are hidden. We have only some of their first names. But in a way, they are the center of the story, even though I'm looking primarily tonight on the white players in this story. To say that Quakers were opposed to slavery tells us only one small piece. Quakers have had a very long and complicated history with slavery and the buying and selling of enslaved people. From England to the West Indies Sugar Islands to North America, Quakers were intimately tied to slavery and the slave trade. Quakers actually advocated for slavery. In the beginning, there was no talk of manumission. It's perhaps not the picture we've seen over the years. However, by the third quarter of the 1700s, a few voices began to ask if it was appropriate for friends to buy and sell slaves. This was enough, this small little questioning, for the Quaker leadership to begin promoting what came to be known as benevolent slaveholding. Those faint voices of questioning turned out to be threatening. George Fox, the founder of the Society of Friends, proselytized on behalf of slavery to weave a path between these gentle anti-slavery inquiries and the harsh reality of slave life. He promoted something called benevolent slavery. It has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? Be sober and fear God, he said to the slaves, and love your masters and mistresses, and be faithful and diligent in your master's service and business, from 1671. He implored slave owners to treat their enslaved men and women nicely, and in return asked slaves to basically grin and bear it. There was no substantive move to question slavery from any of the North American meetings during this early period of settlement. In the later years of the 1600s, there was a local meeting in Germantown, Philadelphia, who were asking how could slavery be acceptable? They based their argument on the biblical golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And there was a slightly stronger recommendation coming from the Pennsylvania Quarterly Meeting in the year 1711, which proposed that slavery should be, quote, discouraged, close quote. In hindsight, a rather meek and safe recommendation, but for its time, representative of the power that slavery held over the Friends. And that's where Quaker anti-slavery stood until 1767 in Dutchess County. How did we get to that point? The Quakers' influence in Dutchess County spanned about a century, from the arrival of the first Quakers in 1728 to the Hicksite split in 1828. After spending decades on Long Island in the early 1700s, Friends migrated to both Rye and Purchase. And in 1728, the first Quaker on the Oblong, Nathan Birdsall, settled at what became known as Quaker Hill. The Oblong, as you probably know, is the thin stretch of land on the far eastern border of Dutchess County, running its length up to Columbia next to the Connecticut line. And after Birdsall, a quick succession of settlers followed. Soon Quaker Hill was applying to purchase for its own meeting, which it received in the 1730s, followed by the building of a meeting house in 1742. They got a new house in 1764, which is what you're looking at now on this slide. That building still stands. If you have not been there, I certainly urge you to see it. They have a great display. It's a fabulous building. Hard on the heels of the Oblong came the 9-partner settlement located near what is today Millbrook. This is one of several houses that had been built on the site. The meeting house here we see dates from about 1780, and that children's drawing is from sometime in the period around 1800 or so. Quickly after that came the Oswego meeting, located near the present-day Route 82 at Moore's Mill. And then after a few years, 9 partners in Oswego were granted their own meetings. And the last of this early phase of growth was the Clinton Creek meeting. 70% of the settlers during this period originated from Massachusetts and Rhode Island, the largest group outside of Philadelphia. One of the early preachers in the Quakers here in eastern Dutchess County was John Woolman. He was influenced, his influence was strong. He was an itinerant preacher. He spent a lot of time here, both at the Quaker Hill and at the 9-partner site. His essay in 1747, Some Considerations on the Keeping of Negroes, was widely distributed. And he also was questioning the issue of Quakers holding and trading in slavery. And in 1767, the Oblong meeting took a momentous step, and they riled up the waters of Quaker custom. The meeting sent a query to the Purchase Quarterly meeting asking it to reply to their concerns about slaveholding. The query was entitled, Inconsistency of Slave Keeping with Our Religious Principles. In it, they asked Purchase to provide answers to 5 questions. Isn't slavery a harm to both slave and owner? Doesn't slavery deny the slave freedom to obey his or her inner light? They questioned the buying and selling of slaves as well as owning them. They asked, should Quakers free their existing slaves? And finally, they wanted to know, how can we be diligent Quakers and maintain slavery. With this step, with this question, Dutchess Quakers put themselves at the forefront of anti-slavery efforts, not only within the Society of Friends, but of the American colonies. This was a very, very advanced questioning during this time, coming as it did as well within the near period of the American Revolution. This query was a full-blown questioning of the accepted way of life. And their questions exposed, as they write, the inconsistencies of the Quaker slavery position. If slavery was a harm to the slave, as it certainly was, people knew that conditions for many slaves were horrible, especially in the Sugar Islands. Must not it also be a harm to the owner? That is, harm to his spiritual life. Quakers believed that action was individually driven by one's inner light, but how could slaves follow an inner light that told them their enslavement was wrong? It was accepted in many quarters that holding a slave was okay, but the buying and selling of them was of a different degree. Why should this be? The oblong asked. The oblong also asked directly for an answer about what do we do with our current slaves? And lastly, given all of the above, how can we be diligent Quakers if we hold slaves? Purchase would not handle the question. They actually sent a snooty reply saying that the tendency of this query was to stir up trouble. They sent it along to the New York Yearly Meeting, who tabled it for 2 years. And finally, in 1769, the Yearly Meeting dismissed it for fear that manumission would, quote, turn out slaves at large indiscriminately, resulting in great inconveniency. Indeed, it would. Interestingly as well, is that neither Oblong nor 9 partners had waited to get approval before ridding slavery from their meeting. As early as 1759, 9 partners brought complaints against Jonathan Latham and Daniel Tobias for buying slaves. Tobias complied, agreed to stop. Latham was unresponsive and disowned. In 1762, charges were brought against 3 other men for buying slaves, and additional charges brought against one of them for being, quote, familiar in a carnal manner, close quote, with his female slave. All 3 disowned. I just love that phrasing. Familiar in a carnal manner, in other words, rape. Despite their advanced position, however, the anti-slavery Quakers had slow going in terms of getting rid of their slaves. Owners chafed at the idea of giving up workers that they needed. And it took until 1790 for the last slave owned by Quakers to be removed. It's instructive to take a short look here now at the sense of the slave population in Dutchess County. We have only very, very rough numbers for the number of slaves held prior to the first census of African Americans in 1790. So I've singled out a few towns here, Amenia through Washington, and I've put Fishkill, Poughkeepsie, and Rhinebeck down for comparison's sakes. Those 3 towns obviously were on the river, closer to transportation and other trade opportunities, and the number of enslaved people in those 3 areas far overwhelms any place except perhaps the Clinton area, where there was reasonably substantial numbers. So 1790 was the first African-American census. 1800, things are fairly stable, a little bit of a drop perhaps. In 1799, New York State finally agreed to a long, slow process of manumitting slaves. 1810, there's a distinguishable drop here, and in 1820, quite a few less in most cases in eastern Dutchess County. Now we're only 17 years away from the emancipation in New York taking effect. A lot of slave owners actually did free their slaves. A lot of other slave owners illegally sold their slaves to places down south. We have the names of some of the enslaved people who were living here. It's only their first names. We don't have full names for most of them. So we have Tom in Beekman, Primus, Cuff, Prince, Palm in Washington, George at 9 Partners, Peter at Beekman, and quite a few others from that. So this is kind of where the Quakers took us up to basically the Revolution. There was a lot of small instances or hints at, gee, are we really doing the right thing? But it took advanced Quaker thinking and feeling and meditating on what it meant to be a Quaker and what it meant to be an enslaved person to push this issue to the forefront in 1767. Now, the next phrase is working through the dilemma of worldly action. It wasn't easy being a Quaker. There were quite a few restrictions on the things that they could do, one of which was to join other organizations where they might be mandated to take action, to take orders, to do something. And that tended to come into conflict with following their own inner light. So for a lot of Quakers who were getting involved in the anti-slavery movement, rather than just freeing their own enslaved people, they were faced with some difficult choices. And by the early 1800s, slavery had become a nationwide, even an international issue, far beyond the ken of local meetings that we would see in the middle 1700s. And the politics of anti-slavery were morphing into a more radical and a more publicly political realm. Quakers were inevitably faced with how to confront these changes while maintaining their religious principles. It was a trying time. So the field of action in this area is very, very broad, very complicated with lots of issues, and it's impossible to cover all of this in a program tonight. So what I want to do for the next part of this is to highlight 3 Quakers to provide a window and allow us to see some of what was happening during this period in early 19th century Quaker anti-slavery. 2 of the 3 here, Lucretia Mott, David Irish, and Aaron Powell, were Dutchess County natives. All 3 had schooling here, all are Quakers. All were radicalized by their education and by the new radicalization of the anti-slavery movement. And each of these 3 tied into 3 issues that were important during this time. Mott was born in 1793 in Nantucket to a devout Quaker family. Devout for them meant a strong adherence to the inner light. Individuals had the authority, even duty, to find the correct way for them to live as Quakers, not beholden to anyone else's idea of what they should be doing. She developed a strong resistance to restrictions, and she spent her life fighting to be heard, both on behalf of the enslaved people and on behalf of women. Her latest biographer, who you're going to hear next month, called her a heretic, but that was in an admiring way. In 1806, at age 13, she came to board at the Nine Partners School, which was immersed in a strong anti-slavery curriculum. You can actually find a lot of their curriculum materials and see what they were teaching. The school was founded by James Mott Sr., who was the grandfather of Lucretia's future husband, also called James. How best could it be, or what was the best way for Quakers to undermine the institution of slavery? As I said, it was difficult for them to join other groups or merge or work with other churches, submitting to other leadership. Those things generally would have been opposed or in opposition to the inner light. So there were few public venues for them to operate in. Oops, where did I go with my full screen here? Whoops, oh, here we go. Oh, sorry about that. Sorry, I hit the wrong button. Okay. During the 1700s, the idea of something called free produce was developing within the Quaker world. And the idea of the free produce movement was to abandon the use of any product made with slave labor. And primarily, we're talking here about sugar, cotton cloth, indigo dye are three of the major ones. And you could substitute, theoretically, maple syrup, linen and wool, and collect some blueberries and blackberries or maybe purple cabbage to make something akin to the dye you might need. This proved to be a way for Quakers to help stem the tide of slavery by curtailing the use of slave-made products. If they could close off markets for slave goods, they could put slave owners out of business. That was the theory. Once again, there was great appeal to this. A number of Quaker preachers, including early on John Woolman, promoted it. Now, the importance of the movement became more severe as the drive for sugar became more important. The drive for sugar was partly driven from something going on in Europe, which was the increase in the use of tea and the demand for sugar in the tea. But of course, it spread way beyond that. And Europe and America essentially developed a sweet tooth. And it was pretty much impossible not to want to use sugar after millennia of not having that kind of sweet. Likewise with cotton. The cotton gin, starting in the mid-1790s, promoted a vast expansion of putting land under cotton, available now to make into cloth. And there was a third impetus. It was an avenue for Quaker women to get involved in the public sphere, from which they were usually barred. The movement was strongest in the Midwest, Pennsylvania, and New York. James and Lucretia Mott were early and avid supporters. And since they were involved in other aspects of the national anti-slavery movement, they had a great deal of influence on this subject. Between 1817 and 1862, they supported the building of 53 stores in the East and Midwest for storing and for selling free produce goods. Also, many groups of free Blacks took part in this, establishing both free labor groups and stores run by and for Blacks. Now, this Blood in the Soup cartoon is a particularly gruesome way that Quakers promoted the horrors of slave-made products. In a sense, what this cartoon is saying, they were warning that the sweat and tears of the enslaved person found their way into the products of the slave owner. Here's a picture of an example of a tag that would be attached to a bale of cotton not produced from slave labor. And the tag has got the American Free Produce Association, manufactured therefore, and free labor cotton, it says, and it has number of yards, etc. So these types of tags were put on a number of different products as we went along, or as they went along. David Irish is a really, really fascinating character. He was another supporter of the free produce movement. He was a lifelong resident at Quaker Hill. Born in 1792, he came of age as the country began wrestling with the slavery issue. According to his daughter, his mind was strongly influenced to an active protest against the evils of slavery. He and his family made maple syrup to take the place of sugar, cane sugar, and used only linen and wool for their clothing. And they continued with this practice until the slaves were emancipated after the Civil War. Every man, he said, distinguishes or disdains the idea of knowingly purchasing stolen goods of the robber, upon the principle that it would be approving and encouraging the act. But alas, how few hesitate to purchase slave produce of the master merely because he has robbed the slave according to the forms of the law. How do we distinguish, Irish was asking, taking something that the slave owner stole versus something that the slave made? It was a very powerful question to be asking. Lots of other Quakers joined in this movement, and it seemed to take on a widespread appeal. However, it did not last. Well, it lasted actually up until almost the Civil War, but its impact was really muted. First of all, there was not enough free cotton available. Sugar could be found everywhere, but maple syrup was tougher. It was seasonal, and there were long periods in between where syrup would not be available. Despite what Lucretia Mott attempted to do, there were few stores available to Quakers to purchase the goods, and there were fewer goods in those stores. Quakers who were looking to purchase certain goods might have to wait months and months to get them. The goods, because of this, were more expensive and often of poorer quality. Lucretia Mott, one of the biggest proponents of the free produce movement, nonetheless lamented, unfortunately, free sugar was always included taints other than that of slavery. Free umbrellas were hideous to look upon, and free candies an abomination. I had to look up what was happening with the umbrellas back at that time, but they were made from cotton cloth, and they were coated with some kind of oil to provide some protection from the rain. But there was a bigger problem. It was that the increasing demand for slave products meant that there were growing an increasing number of markets. And these markets called upon a growing trade, both internal and external. And Quaker businessmen were heavily engaged in this trade. Men such as Moses Brown of Rhode Island. He was a Quaker and a devout anti-slavery advocate. But he also became rich from his profits of the West Indian rum business. He and other Quaker businessmen were financial backers of both Eli Whitney and the cotton gin and Samuel Slater's textile mill, making cloth from homegrown slave cotton. And the free produce movement was increasingly seen to be an ineffective tool against the slave power. As the power of the southern states in the 1800s began to increase and Northerners felt more pressure and the slavery issue became more acute, debate arose over the best ways to fight the growth and the political risk of slavery. Abolitionists such as William Lloyd Garrison argued that it was distracting from the real issue, the need to fight for immediate abolition. So as worthy an idea as this was, the free produce movement ran up against the realities of supply and demand, market forces, and the growing radicalization of the anti-slavery movement. The Underground Railroad was a big part of the activity of a number of Quakers in the eastern part of Dutchess County. In fact, it was important within the entirety of Dutchess County. So along the eastern side of the county is something that we call the Quaker Trail to Freedom. And it involved the Oblong, 9 Partners, and Oswego sites, possibly Crum Elbow, and maybe a couple of other Quaker sites as well. It was a part of a necklace of Quaker meetings that extended from New York City up to Vermont. In fact, Roland Robinson and his wife, who ran a farm up outside of Burlington, attended the 9 Partners School. So there were a lot of connections along the way among the various Quaker meetings. Quakers could travel from New York to Burlington without ever sleeping in a non-Quaker house, and so could freedom seekers. There was a commensurate river trail over by the Hudson River, and the anti-slavery movement there was led by Black churches, free Black communities, and a considerable number of anti-slavery white men and women. But a very important part to remember about the Underground Railroad, the enslaved people started out by emancipating themselves. They weren't freed by white people in the North. They had already taken steps to free themselves, and the Underground Railroad helped them to get to a final place of hopefully permanent freedom. Lucretia Mott was a lifelong advocate for the enslaved people and Blacks afterwards, and equal rights for African Americans. Here in Dutchess County, as I mentioned already, David Irish was a powerful supporter and participant in the Underground Railroad. David is actually one of the few people that we actually have some documentation for. His daughter remembered that runaways stayed inside Irish's home, where they ate meals together and with no distinction made in the family on account of his color. He was treated as an equal. The 9 Partners School was most assuredly a way station for freedom seekers. Jacob and Deborah Willits, who were members of the 9 Partner and teachers at the school, almost certainly were involved. At the Oswego Friends near Moore's Mill were the home of Alfred and Charlotte Haight, who have been identified as supporters of the Underground Railroad. Valentine Halleck connected 9 Partners to Oswego and then across the river to the Milton meeting in Marlborough, often channeling freedom seekers by ferry across the river. And then here in the eastern part of the county, we had free Black communities in Lithgow and in Freemanville, and both of those are possibilities for way stations for the underground travelers. We're very interesting. What you see here is one example of what have become known as runaway slave ads. And this is for an enslaved person named Mary, and it's fabulous. It strikes you right at the beginning. Ran away on the 29th of July, 1802, a mulatto girl named Mary. The reason of her now being advertised is that I have heard of her being at the 9 Partners. And then it goes on from there. So this is a very exciting find here. And this would serve as some evidence, not proof positive, but certainly a strong indication in support of 9 Partners being involved in this activity. A couple of years ago, researchers Susan Stesson-Cohen and Ashley Biagini published a book called In Defiance. And in that book, they identified and published over 500 runaway slave notices from within Dutchess County. It's the largest number of any of the counties in the Hudson Valley. 500 runaway slave ads from within Dutchess County. Difficult to confirm all the speculation, but clearly there was help being given to freedom seekers along this eastern side of the county. And the last of our trio tonight is Aaron Powell. He may be less well known to some of you, but he was just as important. He was one of the youngest of the later generation of anti-slavery Quaker advocates. A native of Stanford, he was born in 1832. He attended school in Dutchess County. Then at age 14, his family moved a few miles north to Ghent in Columbia County. There were large portions of Columbia County in the 19th century was populated widely by Quakers, as much so as there were Quakers in eastern Dutchess County in the 1700s. Now, a few years after he moved there, there was an anti-slavery convention in Ghent, his hometown. And he became attracted to all the commotion. And after seeing and talking to people and talking with his family, he decided he was going to give up the idea of going to college to devote himself to anti-slavery. So he asked permission of his parents to attend another convention on his own. And at age 18, he went up to an anti-slavery society being held in Washington County up near Lake George. Powell was clearly looking for a cause, and the cause found him. While he was inside of a church talking with a group of convention attendees, Sojourner Truth, as Powell describes it in his memoirs, who had been standing alone by the pulpit, she came slowly down the aisle to us, about midway in the church, and reaching out her long, bony arm, placed her big black hand on my head, saying as she did so, with prophetic tone in her peculiar dialect, I've been a-looking into your face, and I sees you in the future pleading our cause. To be singled out like that, then baptized by one of the national heroes of anti-slavery. I tell you, when I first read this story a few weeks ago, I got the shivers. It was the passing on of the torch to a new generation. And so Powell did, becoming one of the youngest anti-slavery men of the next generation. As a supporter of the free produce movement, an editor of the National Anti-Slavery Standard, and after the war, as an advocate for equal treatment of African Americans against racism. So these leaders of anti-slavery were all products in one way or another of Dutchess County and its Quaker heritage. They are worthy of our attention and appreciation in our country's long struggle against enslavement. In the end, the disputes within the Friends over the proper stance to take on anti-slavery played out in free produce, the Underground Railroad, a more radical abolition, not to mention the split coming in the movement in 1828 between what became the Orthodox and the Hicksite wings. But it was also the intensity of the new slavery world in which they were living. It was becoming much more difficult to operate in that area. Now, I was asked also to spend a few minutes talking about another native son, and I'm going to do that. It was James Talmadge Jr. He was born in Stanford, and in 1819, he introduced what, well, let me just tell the story first, and then we can talk more about it. So he was in the House of Representatives, and he introduced his famous amendment on the Missouri bill for admission to the Union. Now, there's a map that can explain a little better than a lot of words can. Missouri Compromise. Yeah, the Missouri Compromise. So here's the situation, if we look at this map for a moment. So the free states are in blue up in your top right corner. And essentially, they were free of enslaved people, of course, not New York and not New Jersey. The New York emancipation wouldn't finally take effect until 1827. And New Jersey pretty much had slave laws on their books up until just about the Civil War. So, but for all intents and purposes, everybody knew this was free territory. All of the red states down here in the South, it was understood that they were going to be, or in fact, most of them already were, slave states. Now, this interesting line going across here is a particular parallel that became famous. This is the 36 degrees, 30-minute line splitting the whole middle of the country. And it was commonly understood that all of the territory north of this area would not be enslaved. There was not problems, but there were challenges with the weather and everything else. And down here, this was generally understood that there are probably going to be some more slave states. But Missouri comes along in 1819 and applies for admission. And that's what caused a lot of trouble. And that is what caused David Talmadge to introduce his bill. It read very shortly that provided we'll accept them, provided that the further introduction of slavery or involuntary servitude be prohibited, and that all children born within the said state after the admission thereof into the Union shall be free at the age of 25 years. So once they were permitted to come into the Union, they could not bring any more enslaved people into the Union, and anyone who was any slave person at the time of admission, they all had to be freed at age 25. This was totally unexpected. Talmadge came from a wealthy family in Connecticut, and they moved to Stanford, where he was born. They were politically connected to leaders of the American Revolution. At 24, a young age, he was serving as secretary to Governor George Clinton. He was described variously as independent-minded, and of course, he did not even tell Clinton, his political mentor, that he was going to do this. Others said he was politically eccentric and wrong-headed. Some others said he had long been an able and liberal advocate of humanity. A year before the Missouri issue, he also had opposed the admission of Illinois to the Union because they didn't have an anti-slavery clause in their provision. And going back even further, it was amazing to find this. At his commencement ceremony in 1798, from the College of Rhode Island, later to become Brown University, he spoke on the immorality of the international slave trade. So he was a mixed bag. But what happened to cause such a concern? Every single state representative and senator said, unless you get rid of this, we are going to secede from the Union. Part of the issue, or let's say the largest part, goes back to cotton. You remember I mentioned that the cotton gin was introduced in the 1790s. Here's the effect it had. A lot of the new land that was being opened up for farming was down here, Mississippi, Louisiana, in this area. In 1790, Mississippi had essentially zero exports of cotton. 2 years after the cotton gin, they exported 6 million pounds. By 1800, they exported 20 million pounds. As more land became available, more cotton was grown. The Mississippi slave population doubled in each of the 4 decades prior to the Civil War. The total US slave number in 1800 was under 1 million, about 900,000. In 1810, it had grown to 1.2 million. In 1830, 2 million. In 1860, 4 million. Now, this is not all due to the cotton gin, but a substantial portion of it. And I know when your grade school or high school books talked about Eli Whitney and the cotton gin, well, it actually was a very substantial truth to that. The northern states, if they weren't aware of the importance of this, they soon became aware. The reaction from the South was matched by a reaction from the North. New York's legislature voted 117-4 to direct its representatives in the House to vote in favor of the amendment. Talmadge left the House in 1819. He only served 1 term, missing most of the debates and the ultimate compromises. But in his first speech on the amendment, he replied to Representative Howell Cobb from Georgia, who warned that there's going to be bloodshed and violence. Talmadge shouted back, "Let it come." So eventually, a couple of compromises were made in 1820 and 21, and the issue receded for a little time. So compromising is where they ended, and compromising is where I'm going to end right now. And I'll be happy to take any questions if there are any. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop share now. I just hit it, yep.
Well, first of all, Peter, I'd like to thank you for a really informative review of and new things that I certainly was not aware of. I think it was a wonderful talk, and I also appreciate the way you delivered, enunciated it, made it clear to all of us, and I thank you very much for that. And I think
thank you.
turn it over to anybody who has questions. And I'm sure there are many. So,
You can also, if you don't want to speak, you can put your mouse down at this invisible bar at the bottom. There's a little word chat, and click on that, and it brings up a little window, and you can type your question in there. But let's see some hands.
Judge Rosenblatt, yeah.
Oh, the judge.
Please unmute yourself, Judge Rosenblatt.
Rosenblatt, Poughkeepsie, New York, Pleasant Valley. Wife Julie,
Right.
and we thank Peter for a fine piece of scholarship and a talk that we all really appreciate. It breaks up not only the monotony, but adds scholarship and interest and liveliness to our intellectual lives and our historical interests. Peter, we all recognize, of course, that when the federal government started its monstrous enforcement in the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 for people who harbored or hid or otherwise protected the enslaved, what I, for one, had been unable to find was the actual extent or instance of actual prosecutions, instances in which people were fined or went to jail. We all knew that the threat was there, but can you shed any light on that for us?
That's a very good question. And we know a number of the fugitives who were taken back. And I want to end up this little part here with a very quite an amazing coincidental story. But the outcome and the conclusions of some of those, you're right, they are often difficult to find. Sometimes the judges in these cases just said, okay, fine, you got to go back and, go back home, or sometimes they were dismissed for lack of evidence. However, a lot of these cases never came to light because oftentimes you would have an agent from the southern states who would come up and claim a particular free black at that time, and who would be taken back to the South, often without any process of going before a justice, et cetera. There are some newspaper accounts that have some of this information, but you're right. It's hard to get, some of the, I guess, the court records, quote unquote, are not so well available. Sometimes they just don't exist. There are basically, you kind of have to go through newspaper accounts. And we do find some instances where we get, an outcome, but there are not too many. One that we do have is, when I found this out, I was just blown away. So for a number of years, and some of you may be familiar, Judge, I think you perhaps are, and I know a few people in the audience are. In 1840, an enslaved person from South Carolina was about to be sold by his owner. And he ran away and came all the way up to Poughkeepsie. His name was John Bolding. And John Bolding established himself in Poughkeepsie as a tailor, and apparently had a fairly successful business. He married. And then we had the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, and lo and behold, in 1851, a visitor from South Carolina, believe it or not, actually recognized him and said, this person belongs down south, etc. So the attorney for the Southern District, I guess it was called that, of New York, in 1851, came to Poughkeepsie and trying to be clandestine, took hold of John Bolding and quickly got him on a train. In fact, the story is that he waited until like 5 minutes before the train arrived at Poughkeepsie, so he could whisk John Bolding away quickly, although people found out about it and they made a big shout, etc. John Bolding was taken in front of the justice, and the decision was, not surprisingly, that yes, he did belong to this South Carolina slave owner. So the case was, eventually the people in Poughkeepsie raised about $2,000 and John Bolding was brought back. But the fascinating part of this story is that the attorney for the Southern District who came up and got John Bolding was someone by the name of Benjamin Talmadge. And when I first heard that story several years ago, I said, they got to be related. I mean, how many Talmadges are there? Well, in fact, James was a cousin to Benjamin, and Benjamin was the son of another Benjamin Talmadge, who was in the Revolution on Long Island and was the head of the Culper spy ring and a close associate of George Washington. So I'm sorry to get aside from your question. I answered it as best I could, but the other part of this story is so fascinating that I couldn't not tell it.
Well, Talmadge is
Oh, by the way, I'm sorry. I also found out, I never saw this show, but apparently there's a TV show called Turn, which is looped around the Culper spy ring of the Revolutionary period.
And
yes, go ahead.
who's the Talmadge from Georgia that is a famous
I haven't been able to link them, but there may be.
Herman Talmadge.
Herman Talmadge. Yeah, Talmadge was a
Senator
very
from
big and popular name.
Yeah.
So I've done a little bit of a genealogy linking up the Talmadges up here, but
Mhm.
not all of them.
Any other questions? I have one.
Sure.
I read in Dell Upton's master's thesis
Mm-hmm.
about, the sort of the history of the Friends meeting here, the Creek meeting,
Creek.
that a lot of the records were destroyed by fire.
Yeah.
And I've also noticed that there seem to be some records at Bryn Mawr.
Mm-hmm.
Have you gone through those at all?
No, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Go finish your question.
So, it's very sad to me because of our interest at the Creek meeting that we really know so very little about any activities that, might have been taking place among members of the Creek meeting. And I noticed you didn't have any.
Well, the three repositories, and there may be other, but the three big ones are Bryn Mawr, Swarthmore, and the school where my daughter got her master's degree, which I'm drawing a blank on now.
And were you?
No, Becky.
No, yeah.
That's all right. I'll tell you the third one in just a minute.
Haverford?
What's that?
Haverford?
What?
W.
Anyway, so and the problem the problem with those libraries is a lot of the stuff isn't digitized, so it's hard to look online. You actually have to go to those places. I've been wanting to do that for a year or more myself, but of course now with COVID, I don't know how soon we're going to get there. Unfortunately, a lot of records, and I remember Dell mentioning that, there's nothing we can do if they don't exist. It's heartbreaking as a historian for all of us, obviously, but sometimes there's letters that go back and forth and you can try to piece a little bit in, but if the meeting minutes aren't there, that's, yeah.
Can you hear me? I can't raise my hand because I'm reached across because I'm at my
Sure. Absolutely, I can hear you just fine.
Okay, my question is, given that I realize, I think I know my own answer to my question, but you don't have the names of these slaves by and large, the last names, because I was curious, since we know many of the white families that are up here for generations, whether or not any of the Black people that live here are descendants of the original slaves, and whether or not that's been investigated or can be investigated because of the name problem.
Right. So a lot of different parsing out there. The free Black community at Freemanville, down closer to Dover, Val Labardier, who is the historian, and she's also the head of the Dutchess County Genealogical Society. She's done a lot of work on this. As far as we can tell, there is no remnant of anyone from the Freemanville community. The Lithgow community, I have not done anything on that. David Greenwood, I don't know if he's on the call tonight. I think David has looked at it a little bit. The only way to determine whether existing Blacks, African Americans in the area might have descended from such and such, first of all, you'd have to do a genealogical search, but even when you got back to, let's say, 1800, and you got back to Dutchess County, could you verify that a particular person was descended from that? It'd be very, very difficult. Not necessarily impossible, but very, very difficult. There are a couple of very expansive programs going on now. One major one that I'm aware of with the New England Historic Genealogical Society, and even though it's New England, it has a very, very expansive database and growing all the time on African American genealogical information. That would be one place to look, but you'd have to interview the current person living in your community and see if you can get some history and genealogy from them. They could probably tell you right away, no, nobody lived here. We came from Chicago, or we came from, doing those kinds of searches can be very valuable and exciting, but they are time consuming, and you have to keep really, really accurate records, because you can go down a rabbit hole.
I don't know how many Black churches there are up here, or whether everyone is integrated. But if there are Black churches, they would probably be a way to find out about their members, as to whether any of them, by rumor or by themselves, knew whether this was true in the community.
That's part of the search. Yeah, that's part of the search you would have to do.
Yeah.
To try to dig that stuff out.
And the other question I have was sort of related to who ended up today living here, is when you gave those interesting numbers about different, like Rhinebeck having 400 and some people, and Clinton having X number, and I think it was 80s or whatever. What percent, if you can't do it by town, but by that era, what percent of the people up here were slaves and or freemen? In other words, the Black population versus the white population.
Correct. Let's see, I might have some of that information. And if I don't, I will get it for you. I could send a couple of things to.
And of course, that would be very low compared to if we were to take a state like Alabama or Arkansas or Mississippi in the South. They're often outnumbered whites in many places. But I was just curious as to how small or sized it was up here, actually.
Well, we can get that information certainly beginning in 1790, when the first African-American census was taken, and then of course every decennial however, there are also in the alternate 5 years, New York State conducted its own census. So you should go to both the federal census, the decennial one, and then New York State conducted its own censuses. I don't know if they had one in 1805, but certainly through most of the middle decades of the 1800s. And that will helpful as well in terms of movement, because you don't have to wait 10 years to find where movement is. You could find it in 5-year chunks. I do have something about the percentage of Black people in a particular area who were enslaved, but I'll have to send that up to Cynthia and have her, email that to you.
Okay.
I don't have my fingertips on it at the moment.
No rush, but thank you very much for the wonderful information you.
Sure, thank you. Thank you.
I can tell you that those figures for the town of Rhinebeck, which was over 400 in the 1790 census, was more than 15% of the total population of the town of Rhinebeck in that census.
Mhm.
And that compared, there is no southern state in the 1790 census that has as great a population of slaves as a percentage of the statewide population
Mhm.
than we did here in Rhinebeck.
Interesting.
I was also surprised by the number here in Clinton, which, if it was such a Quaker stronghold, it really surprised me that we had such a large number. Although we also, Clinton included Hyde Park,
Yes, it did.
Time.
Right. Yeah,
which had a higher,
they had a higher number.
the
Mhm.
Dutch, and the Dutch people were more likely to be slaveholders, I think.
Yeah,
And-
in general, that would be true.
Yeah.
In general, that would be true. But overall, for the county, the average number of enslaved people by household, and this like countywide, was only 2 or 3. So one thing that tells you is that families were pretty much broken apart, which is kind of a traditional characteristic of enslavement, at least in the United States.
Were there more slaves along the river where they had some of the biggest states? Which were they
Oh, by far.
by far?
Yes,
Yeah.
by far. Yeah. We saw some of the numbers today where, in Eastern Dutchess, we might have 150 or maybe even 200, but you got Rhinebeck with 300 or 400. Fishkill was also huge. And a lot of that had to do with, of course, it was agriculturally based until later in the 1800s, but also access to river traffic. So there were a lot of, in fact, the controversy in Rhinebeck at the library over the mural, which is showing a couple of African Americans, presumably slaves, and they are working at the docks, etc. There were also enslaved people working the docks in Poughkeepsie. So it was a combination of high agricultural use and also getting involved in other trades. It's amazing how many, when you look at the runaway slave advertisements, I mentioned Susan and Ashley, they identified the number of different occupations for enslaved people. It's 100 or more. So this is another one of these mythologies about enslaved people. They weren't all just people either working in the household or working on the farm. These were people who ran the boats, they were artisans. They built a lot of the dividing walls in Dutchess County. I don't know how many of those are left now, but a wide variety of occupations.
Well, we didn't have cotton up here,
Did not have cotton.
right? So,
I doubt, maybe somebody was growing cotton, but I don't think so.
We had wheat. I mean, we
Yeah.
were a major wheat producing and export.
Big wheat producing, yes, and also some flax, and yes, but wheat was a big deal.
We were feeding the
Wheat was-
West Indies.
What's
Yeah.
that?
We were the breadbasket for the West Indies, for that enslaved community, which was totally dedicated to
Yep.
sugar and
Thank you. I worked for a number of years at Phillipsburg Manor, and Frederick Phillips was a major. In fact, for a long time, he was one of the richest people. And his trade for wheat that was produced at the two mills in Tarrytown and Yonkers went down to Barbados.
Yeah.
And traded for sugar, white gold.
Yeah.
We could talk all night about this. Yes, Judge, I see your hand is raised.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Pete. This isn't
No.
not a question, but an observation that you might want to comment on that I had, that was prompted by my own research, and I found it astonishing in connection with what you described as the prosecution and arrest of people who were then sent south under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And it was the different roles in the bifurcation of the United States government on the one hand, which was the most active and aggressive prosecutor of the Fugitive Slave Act.
Mhm.
Federal prosecutors, the United States attorneys, would represent the government and the slave owner in the apprehension and rendition of the slave South. But the states, in contrast to the federal government, passed personal liberty laws in which they would resist the federal government. This has an echo to a couple of hundred years later, sanctuary cities. So New York State passed a personal liberty law saying that unlike the federal prosecutors, the county district attorneys were responsible to represent not the slave owner, but the slave. So the district attorneys would represent the slaves by statute, and the United States attorney would represent the slave owner. This was, I thought, an astonishing bifurcation of federalism, the difference between what the states were doing in their personal liberty laws and the United States were doing. Massachusetts went so far as to pass a personal liberty law that said if any Massachusetts lawyer were to represent a slave owner, the lawyer would be disbarred. I thought, can you do that? Well,
Well, you may also be familiar with something similar, which is a lot of the northern states passed laws that said, according to the Constitution, people from one state have to be given all the same liberties as somebody from another state, et cetera, which essentially meant that if a Southern slaveholder brought his or her slaves to a free state, they still had to be accorded the same rights and privileges. However, a lot of states passed laws that said, well, you can bring your slave person here, but you got to leave in 30 days. And they would often take steps to prevent the slave owner from moving out after by the 30-day period, hence freeing that slave. And they would abscond with the slave and try to bring him to a safe place. So there was a lot of stuff going back, and you're right, because the northern states, as the 40s and the 50s progressed, they became more and more aggressive in their action against Southern slaveholders as they entered their state. Yeah.
And of course, that was a major contributing factor to the antagonism of the Southerners who saw these northern states as flaunting the federal law.
Absolutely.
And,
yes.
so that
Right. Absolutely.
Peter, I wanted you to know we have someone who's been with us the entire time from Ohio. Okay,
Oh.
and she said she's really enjoying your talk.
Morning, you can't.
Oh, well,
Okay,
thank
she's out
you.
in Ohio.
So
Oh,
sad.
wonderful. Great.
Can I,
Oh, there's Bill.
hi there.
Hey.
Thank you, Peter. That's excellent. I always learn a great deal and presented very well. And I just wanted to help answer that question about descendants of early African Americans here. And I've done a lot of studying, and Peter has helped a great deal about Andrew Frazier, who was up
Oh,
in
yes.
Dutchess County by the
Mhm.
1760s, helping settle Pine Plains. And Andrew Frazier has a descendant, Shanita White, who lives in Poughkeepsie. I've spoken with her. She's come to some documentary theater we've done about her ancestor. I've shared information with her. And we met through Ancestry, because I keep a tree. But Andrew Frazier has a lot of descendants, and he has people buried in Dutchess County that fought in every war. Poughkeepsie Rural Cemetery, World War II, Stanford Civil War, and you can go back. He fought in the Revolutionary War. So he's probably maybe one of the few who we can really trace from the 1760s to today.
Yep.
Really helpful.
Thank you.
That was all.
That's good. Thanks, Bill.
Okay, Peter, I think we better tie this up right now. But I want to say thank you so much. And you're down in the Bronx, right?
I am.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you all the way down to the Bronx from right now Hyde Park, but
And Ohio.
Clinton. Oh, yes, and Ohio. We got to thank Jerry also, who came to the talk tonight. But thank you so much for sharing with us all of this information. How you found it, I don't know, but I do know you know a lot more
Wow.
than all of us. And we thank you very, very much for coming and being with us tonight to celebrate Black History Month.
Thank you. Just one last thing that I would share, and those who have seen me before know that one of my most important motivations is to look at local history and see where and how it connects to the national scene. And it invariably does. And there's lots of stories there about understanding our local history and how important it is in understanding our society. So thank you all very much.
Hear, hear.
It's been a great pleasure and an honor to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
That's good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
All right.
Aye.
But we heard most of it.